This is the second section. This is the American West, and I'm taking these different lectures thematically, so you'll see the dates and years go backwards and forwards just a little bit, but I think it'll help you understand in the greater sense if we try not to adhere strictly to a straight timeline, just cover things by theme. And of course, because we're doing this thematically, our history of the West is going to start long, long before the Civil War. What do we mean by the West? And when you close your eyes and you think about the West, what do you see? Are we talking about just a physical location, or are we talking about an idea, the idea of the West? You'll find that our general perception of the West has great power in how we think about ourselves as a country. And the problem is that the historical narrative of the West is mixed up with an emotional vision of what the West actually was. So surely, if you can close your eyes and you can imagine the West, and we have this very generic understanding of the West, place with horses and wide open spaces, and these images are important. I mean, they do have real meaning, but we have a very romantic view of the West, and it's predicated on this charismatic view, focusing on the more romantic aspects of the West, ideas and thoughts about masculine identity, self-reliance, strength, and violence. And you can see this two-part understanding of the West on the cover of thousands of romance novels. And think about this little cartoon here. There's an emotional connection that is part of this story. She's falling in love with him. There's music in the air. It doesn't get much more clear, this kind of emotional interaction with this story of the West. And this strong emotional connection is part of the foundational story for Americans. The problem is that this is a totally idealized version of the West, and it doesn't really reflect reality. And of course, as always, the reality is much more complicated. So as a little bit of a thought experiment, after you listened and watched the rest of this lecture, go to Georgia View and watch the video, The Ballad of Rock Ridge. And while you're watching this short little clip, think about all the cliches and all the stereotypes that are in this. It's just a short little clip, but it's full of these ideas of what's in the West. And Blazing Saddles was a Mel Brooks movie. It was a comedy from the early 70s. And the reason that the film is so hysterically funny is because of the satirical stance it takes toward all of these accepted visions of Western history. It takes something we treat very seriously and just turns it completely upside down. Going back to the very beginning, the U.S. interest in the West is directly tied to interaction with the environment. Specifically, in the beginning, I'm talking of the extraction of mineral wealth from the environment. And when I say mineral wealth, I'm talking about valuable minerals, things like gold, pyrite, phosphate, silver, anything that has real commercial value. And these types of minerals are discovered and being extracted in the United States long before the California Gold Rush. And of course, the California Gold Rush is the first thing you think of when you think about gold rush. But there's two very large strikes in the United States well before the 1840s. One is in North Carolina, and it's relatively small a strike. And then there's a much larger strike in Georgia beginning in 1826 near the little village, little tiny city called Villa Rica in 1826. And there's a second, even bigger strike in Georgia in Lumpkin County near what is now modern-day Dahlonega in 1829. In this photo I actually took, this is the inside of one of these mines that I was just referring to in North Georgia. This tunnel is about 700 feet deep, and it runs for more than 2.5 miles under the mountain. The importance of the gold rush, especially the gold rush in Georgia, is this is where people develop a lot of the technology that they carry with them and export to other places like California in later years. So by 1848, people are already open to the idea of mining, and they're comfortable with the techniques and technology required to do so effectively. So on the 24th of January, near Sutter's Mill, California, when they begin to find flakes and nuggets just exposed, sitting out on the ground, people are ready to go harness this wealth. And they're able to just literally pick it up by the handfuls of the stuff. And hundreds of thousands of people move west overnight. Sometimes they've got absolutely no clue. There's no plan B, so to speak, as to what happens when they get there, but they're just so interested in getting a hold of this wealth that they run off with no plan. So in the first 5 years of the gold rush, this is the gold rush in 48, approximately 370 tons of gold is recovered in California. And if you do the math, you calculate based upon what that figure means today, that's about $16 billion today. So what you see being held in this photograph is just the stuff that's right on the surface. It's all the easy stuff to get a hold of, these things you would have found in the first 5 years. Now initially, because this gold is very easy to find, they don't need to do anything more than just kind of wade up and down these streams to find it. But after the first 5 years, the easy to get gold is already picked up. So then they turn to what's called placer mines. These are really small scale. Sometimes they're using a gravity sluice box, but mostly it's a guy sitting there panning soil from the bends and rivers, pulling out flakes of gold and tiny little gold dust. And as this gold is used up and discovered and collected, miners are forced to use more extreme measures to get at the gold. And the next step is hard rock quartz mining. This is the very traditional type of mining where you're just punching a hole, a mine shaft, right into solid rock. And you're not just arbitrarily picking a spot on the side of a mountain and you start digging. You're following a quartz seam into the rock. And this process is extremely dangerous, stupidly dangerous. They're using incredibly primitive equipment. They're working in incredibly primitive conditions. And it's absolutely backbreaking work. And you get the gold by extraction of the ore, and then you pulverize this, and then you use mercury mixed with mercury, and of course mercury is poisonous, to extract the gold. And all of this leaves behind what's called tailings, and they're the leftovers of the mining process. This is of course dumped or washed into rivers, and you can imagine the effect that this has on the environment when you've got tons of mercury and dust and crushed rock just being poured into rivers. And the final type of mining that you see is called hydraulic or monitor mining. And this is a process where you'd have a shunt, some kind of a wooden channel or run connected to a stream, and it will channel water into a ditch and then into a series of pipes. They get progressively smaller, and as the pipes get smaller, it increases water pressure, and then this is aimed at the side of a mountain or a cliff face, and it's used to break up the rock. And then the rock is of course taken, crushed, pulverized, and you still use the mercury, or in later years a cyanide process. Cyanide can also be used to extract gold. The hydraulic mining process is absolutely the worst case scenario environmentally speaking. It's tremendously destructive. It's almost as bad as just using dynamite to just blast away the face of a mountain. And you can see the leftovers of this process right up till this very day. There's a Clint Eastwood Western called Pale Rider, which if no one has ever seen it, it's an excellent movie, just fun to watch. But in this movie there is a section that shows hydraulic mining equipment in operation, and that is pretty much historically accurate. And so after the lecture, I encourage you to go watch that video clip so you'll actually have a pretty good image in your mind of what's actually taking place. This is a photograph of a mountain. It's in a state park in California, and this is the site of a former hydraulic mine. The mine was open in 1853. And think about the picture for a moment. So we're talking the elapsed time of 150 something years, and you can still see clearly all of the damage done to the side of this mountain by the hydraulic mines. And this photograph is fairly typical of the kind of gold that you'd find today. And these small little flakes require a massive amount of labor and equipment to recover. These particular flakes that you see in this photograph were recovered from a river in North Georgia, so they're still around, but the entire process of gold mining has changed completely since the 1840s. Another one of the biggest cliches about the West is cattle. And think about the scene in the saloon from this video, The Ballad of Rock Ridge, that I'm asking you to watch. What are the cows doing and how are they reacting to the cows being there? And you'll see this kind of ubiquitous presence of the cow in the West being illustrated through satire. And the truth is that few other things had such a gigantic impact on the environment than the introduction of cattle. And cattle is very, very important in terms of bringing people west. This is a recently published book by a historian named John Ryan Fisher, and his basic premise in this book is that cattle is one of the central tools of colonialism and conquest, and especially in the West. And he argues that because of the introduction of cattle, both the land and people would become civilized. And he goes back and he looks at the writings of people that were in the West at this time, the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, and he actually records some of the letters, or reports some of the letters written by these men at this time. And one of them says, in no uncertain terms, that being able to be on the land and see these huge herds of cattle was clear and sure evidence of civilization. Now, obviously, following all these cows are cowboys, and the Western films of John Ford portray the cowboy as this towering figure of Western morality, these very manly virtues, but real cowboys were never anything like John Wayne. These vintage Western movies tell you much more about people's perception of themselves, perception of the history of the United States, and life in the 1950s than anything about life in the Wild West, the actual 1830s, 40s, and 50s. So in reality, the American cowboy is pretty much an extension of the vaquero culture from south of the border in Mexico. Cattle are introduced first in Mexico. This is a product of the Spanish conquest. And as ranching spreads west on the continent, an Americanized version of this Spanish vaquero develops. And by the 1880s, and you can see this photograph is 1888, the American cowboy has become pretty much a human Swiss Army knife. They're involved with everything they need to survive out here. So they were doing ranching, construction, fighting Indians, chasing women. I mean, all of these classical elements that you see are taking place here. There's a little bit of truth to this lifestyle, but it doesn't live up to the emotional reference that we have in our mind of what the West actually looks like. And the biggest engine for change, no pun intended, in the West was the steady expansion of rail lines, railroads. So rail lines create access for people that are working and living in the interior to move goods either in or out easily. Because they create access, it further spreads ranching, and it allows people to penetrate further into the continental interior. The expansions of the railroads generate conflict, and they result in the destruction of one Western species of animal, and they result in the eventual destruction of an entire cultural system. And here I'm thinking of Native American societies, indigenous horse cultures of the interior. Now, the Western species is, of course, the American buffalo. And what happens to the buffalo? Well, first of all, the buffalo is an enormous animal. It's what scientists call megafauna, and it's unique to the American continent. And the United States government views this as an obstruction. So settlers, the government, the railroads, the military, they don't look at this as anything but an impediment to the process of civilization and the march of improvement of the environment and of the West. They look at this as just an animal that's slowing down rail traffic, it's taking up valuable real estate, it's interfering with farming, it's interfering with cattle drives and cattle ranching. And at this time we're talking about herds that number millions of individuals, just covering square miles in size. So these animals are a source of, or they're a problem for the expanding United States government and that culture, but they're sustenance for the native societies that are in existence on the interior. So in direct conflict with the idea that the buffalo is a problem, all of these indigenous horse cultures are looking at it as a source of raw material. So it is food, it is medicine, it provides clothes, it provides shelter. You can't feed yourself without these animals in great quantities. And because the buffalo has become so central in terms of food and clothing and shelter, there's a whole culture built around the horse and built around hunting the buffalo, and it spreads from one end to the other. And the horse itself is an introduction to the continent. It was left by the Spanish, but the horse allows these cultures, these indigenous cultures, to have great mobility, to live nomadic lifestyles, and it allows them to easily follow these huge herds of buffalo as they go back and forth and back and forth. And so the folks that are coming out to the West, that are moving to seek gold or to seek opportunity in ranching or working for the railroads or what have you, they have a pretty straightforward solution to the abundance of the buffalo. And it's basically outright extermination. And we're not talking about total extermination of the buffalo. I mean, some of them are still around today, but their numbers shrank in a way that there was never an intention for them to be managed in a kind of modern sense, like we would manage hunting of deer or pigs, what have you. They were just wiping them out wholesale. And what allows this to happen are new types of very high-powered rifles. And you can get fairly rapid fire, and they have huge projectiles, and they're very, very powerful, just like you see in the picture here. We're not talking about modern weapons. We're not talking about automatic weapons that can unload an entire belt of ammunition in just a few seconds. No, we're not talking about that kind of rapid fire, but consider this versus the very, very slow, very, very inaccurate weapons of the Civil War. And you'll see there's a tremendous improvement in both firepower and accuracy. So strongly suggest that you watch this clip as well. It's from a movie called Quigley Down Under. And this will give you a very, very good look at how this new type of technology in the form of a rifle functions. Now, I admit, Quigley Down Under is not set in the American West. It's actually set in Australia, but the point still stands. You're able to see this incredibly powerful rifle, and you can see what would happen when it gets turned against the buffalo. And in this photo, you can see one of these high-powered rifles, not the same one as Quigley had, but it's similar in design. One of these very powerful rifles, and it's leaning against the carcass of a dead buffalo, and you can see dead buffalo just kind of trailing off into the distance all the way out to the horizon. So whoever this person was able to shoot and shoot and shoot and take all these buffalo. Now, while the buffalo are not entirely exterminated, their numbers are reduced to the point where they are no longer a significant creature in this ecosystem. So look at this photograph, and you see these two people are standing on what is essentially a mountain of buffalo skulls. You see the guy at the bottom, and let's say he's 6 feet tall. That should give you, or around 6 feet tall, that should give you some basic feeling for how large this pile of skulls is. And we're talking about millions upon millions upon millions of buffalo just shot. A lot of them left to rot without any kind of harvesting. Sometimes the bones are taken and ground up into rudimentary fertilizer just to get the piles of skulls and bones out of the way. Now, this puts native societies in a very tricky position. You can see these Indians here in the same year as the photograph that I showed you of the mountain of skulls, and they're sitting here in their camp, and the meat that's drying is not something that they ran out to Publix and bought. It's all buffalo meat. Houses in the form of teepees behind them, they're all made out of this leather. Their clothes are made out of buffalo. So this wholesale destruction of the buffalo is driving slowly but surely a conflict with the native societies, and it's putting tremendous cultural and physical strain on the native societies as well. And eventually this leads to a prolonged series of what's called the Indian Wars. And the Indian Wars are really dozens of small wars built around kind of military campaigns. It's easier to think about them as one long sustained conflict. And the fighting in the Indian Wars is extremely savage. There are extreme examples of unbelievable brutality on all sides. And the eventual result of the Indian Wars is the total destruction of the indigenous culture, the end of the nomadic lifestyle, gone much the same way as the buffalo. Now it's important to note that this attack against the Indian culture, the native cultures, has been going on for quite a long time. Basically, when the Spanish landed in the New World in the 15 teens, the Aztecs and the Mayans would agree that they're suffering basically the exact same effects that the native societies that you see pictured here are suffering. And so this antagonism and fighting goes all the way back hundreds of years before the time period we're even talking about. It depends on how far back you really want to go. Now you're going to hear, if you talk to historians long enough, you'll eventually hear someone refer to the Indian Wars as genocide. And by our modern standards today, and let me be very clear what I'm saying, by our modern standards today, you could call it very much so. But you have to remember that you cannot read your own culture and our time back on the past. And the people that are fighting these wars, they do not have words like genocide or ethnic cleansing. And their motives cannot easily be explained by our experiences today. That's not to say that warfare is a good thing or what happened to these native societies is not something that should be troubling. I come from a school of thought that if you don't get upset by a lot of what you see in history, you're not really paying attention, because human history, American history, is oftentimes got lots and lots of dark spots and unpleasant things. But when you're dealing with a situation like this, a history like the Indian Wars, you absolutely have to remember not to read yourself and your own thoughts back in time. And what characterizes the Indian Wars is not the scale of the fight. We're not talking about combat like the scale of the American Civil War. This is not huge armies meeting in a field with artillery support and supply trains that stretch back across an entire continent. It's much smaller scale than that. Now, a lot of this fighting does use quite a bit of the weapons of the Civil War, but the fighting is more like raiding. There's garrison duty in these far-flung outposts. And there's skirmishes, smaller fights that are every bit as deadly, but they're not the same scale as what the United States Army had been fighting before. And if you look at this map, it shows just how widespread this was. Each one of the little red X's is a larger battle than just a couple of guys taking pot shots at each other. And you can see it spreads almost across the entire United States west of the Mississippi. And this rough map of Kansas shows the system of forts and the basic corridor that a train could pass through moving west. And each one of those spots is a garrison or a fort with military personnel ostensibly to guard and keep the route open. And the arrow indicates the approximate location of a place called Fort Wallace. And Fort Wallace is like a lot of other forts, but it just so happens that I've got fairly good pictures of soldiers from Fort Wallace and Fort Wallace itself. And so we're going to be talking a little bit more about that as we go along. But we're not talking about towns connected by interstates here. A lot of this is very remote and isolated places. All right, so every class gets my standard disclaimer about photographs, and this is especially true in this section, and it'll be very true in other sections as well. I do not feel that it is proper for me not to mention that some of the things we're going to talk about are graphic. And when we're dealing with warfare, there's really no way to clean it up and make it pleasant and still do respect to the information. So this is my warning that periodically you're going to see very graphic, brutal pictures, but I do this not to upset you. I do this to reference the point and do respect to the people that are involved. Again, like I've said before, if you don't find certain parts of history startling and disturbing, you are not paying attention. This photograph is of Sergeant Frederick Williams. This is a soldier stationed at Fort Wallace in Kansas, and he was killed in fighting with Indian groups. And you can see what's happened to the body. There's at least 5 arrows driven into the body. Some of them are done post-mortem. There's stab wounds, and a lot of these stab wounds, if you'll notice, there's no blood associated with them, so they were done post-mortem. He's already dead. The heart's no longer pumping fluid when he's cut up. There's slices down the thigh. Yeah, the arm is cut open. The nose is cut open. It's brutal. And this is a way of illustrating the kind of abrupt and savage violence of this type of conflict. So you've got moments where there's tremendous activity, and then you've got moments where there's total and complete boredom out on these far-flung outposts. And this kind of almost schizophrenic lifestyle is pretty typical. Obviously, these guys they don't look like John Wayne riding in a big line to the sound of bugles. These guys are fighting not just Indians, they're fighting boredom as well. But this is that lifestyle that they're living out there in these outposts. The idea of a cultural conflict between the U.S. government, Western culture, if you want to call it that, and the native cultures in the interior is absolutely nothing new. And these ideas go all the way to the highest levels of government. So here we have Andrew Jackson, President Andrew Jackson, speaking before the U.S. Congress in December of 1833, and look at what he says. He's denigrating the industry and the moral habits of the Indians, and he makes the observation outright in fairly clear English that they have to yield to the circumstance, meaning here that the United States will continue to expand or they're going to disappear. They're going to meet with this program of manifest destiny that the United States has spreading from from coast to coast, or it'll be their destruction. And part of this is cultural inertia. It's very difficult to change a program, an idea, if you will, of manifest destiny once it's become part of the foundational ideology of a culture. Even to this very day, we still have very clear idea. I mean, it's in the song, right? From sea to shining sea. This whole idea of the United States eventually controlling this entire continent. And so what develops out in the West is a major fight between the United States Army and many different bands of Indians under somewhat decentralized military leadership. And these alliances that would form between the Indian groups were very nebulous. They were not solid like you would see a contract, like we have an allegiance to NATO, or we have a defensive treaty with Japan. These are not those kind of contracts. They're very loosey-goosey. And you have certain men like Sitting Bull that are military leaders that are able to have groups come around them, and there'll be some fighting, and then they'll kind of dissipate. On the flip side of that, you've got, think of the kind of men that the United States Army are sending into this situation. Men like Philip Sheridan and William Sherman, which we've already seen once before. And think about the training of a soldier like General Sherman. Think about his experience in the American Civil War. Sherman obliterated the better part of the state of Georgia in his effort to bring the Civil War to a close. He was very clear about willing to use the military as an instrument to create destruction to solve the issue. So you have someone with this kind of ideology, with this kind of understanding of the use of the military, being sent into a situation where he's confronted with guerrilla warfare. Now, there's some question historically about who actually said the phrase, "The only good Indians I ever saw were dead." Whether it was attributed to Sherman or Sheridan is really beside the point. I include the quote because I would like you to think about the idea that how this dovetails so nicely with the type of fighting and the type of experience and the type of training that these soldiers would have had, commanding these massive armies in the Civil War, fighting battles where tens of thousands of men would die in a single day. And battles in the Indian Wars range all over, but by far the most famous is the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876. This is Custer's famous last stand. And Custer and his troops are caught out in the open near a creek, Little Bighorn, and there's an absolute bloodbath of the 7th U.S. Cavalry, just absolutely decimated by the Indians. 268 U.S. troops are killed, and basically they're spread out over such an area, they bury them where they fall. There's 55 wounded. 5 of the 7th Cavalry's 12 units are completely destroyed to a man. And the Indians even killed the dogs that were traveling with the soldiers. And you can see on the left-hand side there, this is Custer's tombstone. It's at the very, very center of the cluster. And this also perpetuates certain ideas and mythology about this event and the nature of the Indian Wars. In 1905, this photograph on the right, you've got the Wild West shows that traveled around the country. And one of the favorite things that they would show in the Wild West traveling show was Custer's Last Stand. They'd play it up. It was very dramatic. And you can see the emotional stance and power of this story. You can see it right there in the photograph. And this influences how events like Custer's Last Stand, this fight at the Little Bighorn, is remembered right down to this very day. This is one of the only survivors of the battle, at least as far as the U.S. side goes. This is one of the horses. The horse's name was Comanche, ironically. You can see the arrow pointing to other horses in the background that have been shot and they're laying on the ground. So cavalry gets to the site of the Battle of Little Bighorn pretty quickly, enough so that they can get this horse, and you can still see the others dead on the ground. So they find out what happens almost immediately, and they report this. And news of this attack and the destruction of all these soldiers inflames the aggression. So up until this point, you're really seeing just kind of a small scale skirmish, raids, and things like that. After the Battle of Little Bighorn, the United States Army puts a tremendous amount of men into the field and absolutely does whatever it takes to drive the remaining Indians onto reservations. And this is basically what you see by the late 1880s and into the 1890s. You're seeing almost all of the groups rounded up and forced onto reservations, forcibly removed from different areas. The military puts enough resources into the field that it just overwhelms the groups that are fighting. So strange things begin to happen once you condense all of these formerly separate people and formerly separate cultures onto these reservations. And one of them is the rise of the ghost, what's called the ghost dance. There's an Indian shaman, a Paiute shaman named Wovoka, and he has a vision in the true sense of the word, where he sees Christ, and Christ tells him how that the Indians are going to deal with the white man, and that Christ's second coming will be soon, and when Christ comes back, there'll be a return of the buffalo, and he will give all of the land back. But in order for this to happen, the Indians have to perform what is called the ghost dance, and God shows Wovoka how to do this dance, and he records all of this. He writes all this down, and he kind of disseminates this dance around the reservations. And he claimed that God had told him to come back and tell his people to be good and love one another, not to fight, not to steal, not to lie, but to do this dance and use it as a source of honor. And the ghost dance is essentially what would be called by an anthropologist an ecstatic dance. So what I mean by ecstatic is that through the chanting and rhythmic movements, people develop almost an out-of-body state. And this ecstatic experience spreads from reservation to reservation, and more people began to pick up this ideology of the buffalo coming back and the land being given back and everything going back to the way it was before the reservation system. The closest thing that we probably have to this day to the original ghost dance would be something similar to, and I'm not saying it's the same thing, let me be very clear, would be, you'd see something similar in Haitian voodoo, where the dancing leads to a trance and people enter kind of a fugue state, and it's part of the religious experience, this almost out-of-body ecstatic experience. And this experience and this dance scares the hell out of all of the white folks that are working for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And you can see in this photograph the ghost dance is going on, and indicated by the red arrow is one of the administration buildings. And so these Indians are dancing around, and they're having this trance-like experience, and it's loud, and no one at the U.S. government, Bureau of Indian Affairs, understands it, and so they begin to clamp down on expressions of this ghost dance. It's just too out of the ordinary, and it's too frightening for them to let it continue. And one of the people that gets sucked up into the paranoia over the ghost dance is actually Sitting Bull. And the government fears that if a man like Sitting Bull, that had so much charisma and had the ability to lead troops, began to support the ghost dance and began to spread these ideas, that the reservation system would break down and there would be open combat all over the place yet again. So Sitting Bull actually ends up being assassinated. And this is in December of 1890. Mid-December of 1890, and he actually had a premonition, a vision of his death that was eerily accurate, but he, it turns out, was not involved with the ghost dance in any real sense. He was aware of it, but he was not spreading the teachings or anything like that. Also in December of 1890, there's a band of Sioux Indians, and these Sioux Indians have been on the run from the United States military for years, and they're starving and exhausted, and they agree to go into captivity, and they show up at a place outside, it's near a creek called Wounded Knee Creek. And this group of Indians had been the most resistant to resettlement, had traveled all over the place, had spent time in Canada, and had just finally been ground, the will to resist had been ground down to the point where they were willing to come in and surrender. And what happens at Wounded Knee is definitely a tragedy, but a large group of men, women, and children are ambushed in camp by elements of the 7th Cavalry. And you should remember the 7th Cavalry, they were the ones that were decimated at the Battle of Little Bighorn. So we know for a fact that at least 300 people died, civilians died in this attack at Wounded Knee. Likely more died, but you can see the chief of this group, one of the chiefs of this group, I should say, Chief Bigfoot, and that's his real name. But there he is on the left photograph, and there he is on the right after the incident, and he's been shot, he's dead, and he's actually frozen to the ground, and that's rigor mortis. And this photograph shows the aftermath at Wounded Knee. And you can see from the red arrow how cold it is because the dead body is frozen out, the feet are sticking straight out. The soldiers are kind of posing for the camera. But this is exactly the kind of war that's been going on in the West for decades now. Back and forth with this kind of extreme visions of violence and sucking up women and children and just all of the abuses that come along with it. And this has been going on, like I say, for decades. A lot of people use the Wounded Knee incident as just kind of a convenient place to locate the end of the Indian Wars. With the Indian Wars, you suffer from the same kind of problem that we talked about locating the end of the American Civil War. There's no real tidy way to do so. And even though you have a military defeat, you don't really have a cultural defeat. And this is really by far, I think, the most disturbing aspect of the Indian Wars. There is a concerted effort to acculturate, and that's another anthropology term, to acculturate Indians into Western society. And the example I use here is Tom Torlino. And he's a young Indian boy, and he goes to what's called the Carlisle Indian Industrial Schools, and they're set up by the government to educate Indians in white culture, religion, Victorian era social ideas. And you can see the change that they're attempting to make in someone by the before and then the after photograph. All right. If you want, you can go online and actually research Tom Torlino. The reason that I put him on this slide is because all of his records from the Carlisle School have been digitized, and you can actually read them online. But the history of the Carlisle Indian Schools it's something. It's profoundly disturbing. It's one of those things that'll keep you awake at night if you delve too deeply into it. And the Carlisle Schools are founded by this man here. This is Richard Henry Pratt. And he actually begins to work with prisoners of the Indian Wars as early as the 1870s. And these POWs are held in a place called Fort Marion in St. Augustine, Florida. This is before it became a national park site, obviously, and the name's been changed to Castillo de San Marcos today, but it was Fort Marion then. And part of his program is teaching English, basic skills, Victorian social ideas, and what actually happens is this leads to all manner of sexual assaults, all different types of abuse, disease, and other horrible things going on in this Carlisle system. But the idea was that you would crush the Indian culture and you'd crush this spirit. You could kill the Indian to save the man. And the final nail in the coffin is what's called the Dawes Act. And this is the architect of the Dawes Act. This is Senator Henry Dawes. And this does away with the traditional mode of Indian life. And what you basically get here is each Indian provided with a parcel of land. They're required to settle on that land and become a farmer. And when you settle on the land, you can no longer have that nomadic lifestyle anymore. It also had restrictions in there about who could pass on the land and who could own it, but the idea was to completely do away with the nomadic lifestyle and lock a family down onto a parcel of land. And in the midst of all of this fighting and all of this chaos, tens of thousands of people are moving west. And the move west is more successful once you get to the removal of Indians to reservations. But the wagon trains and the great migrations west are another episode that is full of all kind of special emotional and spiritual meaning for Americans that is not entirely in relationship with the actual reality of the thing. So I'm hoping that some of you at the very least recognize what this slide is actually from, and if you do, that's wonderful. This slide, unfortunately, is not that far from the reality. And this idea of manifest destiny, this great mission, this great civilizing mission in the West, convinces a lot of people to go out there, start a new life, but people are not prepared to confront this environment. And the land, it kills people, kills them in droves. But manifest destiny, the idea, the pride and the emotion of going west and spreading civilization, is a very powerful motivator. The term manifest destiny, the earliest record of it is 1783, but the content of the idea of manifest destiny sticks with us to this very day. And you don't have to look very far to find evidence of it anywhere. The idea of the noble farmer going out with the wagon trains, etc., etc. And the reality of it is that the continent ended up just littered with people that were dead on the trip heading west. Of all the people that moved west, by far the most successful were a group called the Mormons. And the Mormons have a fascinating story. Their founder was a man named Joseph Smith. He's a religious visionary, I guess, for his people. But he's another one of these figures that claims to have a revelation directly from God, and God speaks to him and tells him what to do, and he starts this new religion. And after Joseph Smith's death, leadership passes on to another man named Brigham Young, and that name probably sounds familiar to some of you. Smith dies in 1844, and Brigham Young takes over, and there's persecution wherever the Mormons try to establish themselves. And so what happens is they begin this long process of slowly moving and further west, searching for a place that they can establish themselves and have some control. And they do this over and over and over again. You can see on this map all of the dots as they slowly but surely move out to Utah and what eventually becomes Salt Lake City, which is a big major city today. And so the Mormons stop on the shores of the Great Salt Lake. This is in Utah. It's, look at the picture. It's a beautiful area. And the Mormons are able to establish themselves, and they're able to actually become quite successful in organizing themselves and organizing their own society, and then eventually joining the United States. But this is by far an exception. And even their success should be tempered with the realization of how big a struggle and how long it took them to get there. And this man, Frederick Jackson Turner, in 1893, proposes something very important for the idea of the West, and it's called the frontier thesis. And to boil it down to its basic components, the frontier thesis states that there's something special about the relationship between the land and Americans. And this relationship gives Americans a special spirit, a special sense of nationalism, a special sense of self-sufficiency, and a sense of adventure and danger. And because by the 1890s and 1893, the Indians have been removed, the railroads go from coast to coast, the frontier is closed. And that with the closing of the frontier, you will run the danger of losing important and valuable parts of what it means to actually be an American, to be able to experience these places and these things, to test yourself against the environment. And the frontier thesis is what spurs the development of a lot of the very early national parks. And this is a codified effort to try and preserve some of these wild areas of land in the West, and that is to preserve places where Americans can experience these emotional and physical connections to the land, these places that make Americans unique because they can go out there and experience places that haven't been developed or are wild in terms of nature. The irony is that these places have already been changed because they're full of people grazing cattle or sheep, and they actually use the United States Army to guard the first national parks to keep them from being exploited. So there is actually quite a bit of traction to Turner's thesis about the destruction and the closing of the West.